Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Wednesday, July 28th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, it takes a lot for public servants to speak out. More than 1,200 former Justice Department officials recently decided they needed to. Plus, an $11 billion price tag gets attention. Understanding what the government lost in the process may take a lot longer. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. When the Army launched its Data Operations Center in April, the goal was to create a centralized service that will reduce the burden on warfighters. Over the long term, ADOC hopes to make it easier for warfighters to use artificial intelligence and machine learning tools by turning raw data into refined intelligence. For more on the service's plans for the Army Data Operations Center, Federal News Network's executive editor Jason Miller caught up with David Markowitz, the Army's Chief Data and Analytics Officer at the recent AFCEA TechNet Cyber Conference.
The Army saw a need to connect our tactical units being developed through Next Gen C2, 4th ID, and 25th with the Army enterprise data and to work data issues to support our warfighting commands. And so organizationally, we wanted a place where people could go and call for, like, I need help to get either an application going or network, as opposed to our tactical units having to fish around. So under Army Cyber Command, they've set up a it's an experiment. The expert identifies that Army Cyber will try it out, but it's coming back to Army leadership for evaluation. So far, it's doing well. And its scope is to provide that both a data area as well as all network connectivity. So think the use case in mind is I've got a new UAV or some new ground sensor. I need to connect it and get that view into a situational awareness in our division. Units just go out there. Who do they call? They call the Army Data Operations Center. They help you with the technology, the API, the firewall, the data, the integration, all in one shop. They may not do it themselves, but they are the link back to the institutional Army to help them forward. So the Army's been playing with the idea of operational data teams, and this is now a hub that will provide the grease and the organizational structure and leadership to make that happen.
Because it's Army Cyber, it's because obviously you got to keep the data secure. Is that why it's coming through Army Cyber, or is it just that's where it kind of ended up?
It's a great question. In the Army, we've kind of wondered, where is that back-end support to have it? So the Army's gone through the our transformation initiatives of aligning, FORCECOM no longer exists. It's now Western Hemisphere Command. So where is that back end that provides that support? We wanted an operational command as opposed to the acquisition community to actually run it because they'd be in tune with the operational needs. And so Army Cyber, because they run NetCom, part of the move is to get the Army Enterprise Cloud Management Office, so they'll have the cloud activities, to move some view of the gate or the internet connection. So it's as Army Cyber has full operational control of the network, how to move them up the technology stack, so they've got both applications and data, so our soldiers don't have to fish around for who's the right person in the Army. They've got one group to go to.
The goal here, as you said, is to make it easier for warfighters, soldiers to, hey, we have an idea, we need some help. Where do we start? And then they may come back to you and say, hey, we need some cloud instances. And they may come back to a different part of the Army CIO's office for some development, some DevSecOps pipeline. So give me a sense of, since this is just fairly new, is there an example you can think of that's already kind of went through this process already?
So probably not coming back to the CIO. They've got a lot of Army commands, and the Army's a lot of greater things happening throughout the entire Army. We want the ADOC to leverage forward. So some of the existing ones that have come from 4th ID and 25th that have gone through this process, the Army Data Operations Center, are asking for things like, where do I get predictive weather information? Sometimes that's the Air Force, sometimes the G2, but the unit needs that for weather prediction. Another one was maritime trends, not a normal Army thing. So if a division needs maritime COP, who do they go to for integration? They go to the ADOC, who will then reach out to if it's a fourth estate agency or for the Navy to provide that integration going forward. So two examples where we've had kind of data needs to get integrated to the field to help our soldiers.
And from a data perspective, are there things your office is doing to make sure that data is cleaned up, is available? Where's the CIO's role?
Yeah. So we're the Army Secretary, so we're kind of really high level. So we're really into the governance side, and so we're trying to make sure that the right people responsible for data can be responsive to our warfighters. And it's been amazing actually to see this kind of grow in time. We've had a lot of applications being built because we've now had a very robust data layer. Secretary just signed a bi-directional directive to make sure all of our business systems interact with the data layer so we can have this kind of one place to kind of get our authoritative data. That process has now seen over 4 years. We're now overhauling our data products that are most common usage, like how do we think of soldiers, how do we think of units. Those are being redone based upon this growing demand of application. Our warfighting side is just about to go through that experience of getting all the warfighting data from fires and intel, logistics, gathering it right now. We're going to have a whole plethora of apps as 4th ID and 25th under the Next Gen C2 program, Innovate. And then we're going to probably see a maturation of like, okay, now we're getting serious about enterprise-wide, what's ready for the Army. But for the CIO side, making sure that process works, so you have the right authoritative. Who do you go for log? Who do I go for sensor data? Who do I go to for finance? Or the network operations. Making sure that those people are identified and responsible, so that we've got leaders who can change and be responsive to what the Army needs.
The key to this is obviously APIs, because you're not going to create one big data lake and all this data is going to live. Yeah. Is that something else that your office, the CIO's office at large, is kind of shepherding, offering the governance around to say, hey, if you create this API, here's some guardrails?
Yeah. So the Secretary just initiated a program called Jailbreak that's trying to get better API registration across. We're still in the early stages of that to get that as a complement to the data layer, right, to make sure it's on. And it's super important, the data products that those APIs will transmit. What are you supposed to provide? So that is ongoing. From an enterprise level, we want to make sure there's a catalog that they get registered with, and industry can see it, and our own soldiers can see it, our civilians can see it. So we're in the early process to at least mandate that everyone's, if you're going to come play with the Army, those APIs have to be exposed and shared. And so that's our early stages to making sure that it builds our environment.
You mentioned the memo and business systems. Yeah. Can you just give me a high level? That's the idea, is to make sure that commands and others have access to that data, or what's the goal of that kind of the call for integration, if you will?
Yeah, so for 2 parts. Most pressing is the war. So Operation Epic Fury has identified issues with some of our legacy business applications. Some of them just don't have the business processes to support modern warfare, like logistics. And so, the G4 and the logistics community want to dramatically overhaul how they've been doing. They've found great success using a data layer and applications going from it, both from the Army Material Command, has some wonderful applications. The G4 has been pioneering some activity, and we've seen new exposure of areas of business ops like ammunition handling, ammunition distribution, awareness, that need to be overhauled. So we think the fastest way to do that is to get a data layer with bidirectional to some of our legacy systems. Sometimes contractually a little difficult. How do you have non-person entities make transactional activities with a traditional ERP? So the Secretary signed a directive to ensure bidirectional to our legacy systems, and for us to work through all those issues to get not only technical connectivity, but kind of licensing and the full application management to get the speed for change that we need for the war, and then to modernize some of our legacy systems that have been a little hard to get the lift. And so as we're really thinking enterprise business system convergence, probably now more just enterprise business systems, having a foundational data layer is changing the way we think about how to provide rapid applications, but a solid data foundation with solid transactional cores that can provide a rapid change, both to help the Army modernize, get rid of tech debt, and to support what we're seeing in the theater.
David Markowitz is the Army's Chief Data and Analytics Officer. He was speaking there with Federal News Network's Executive Editor, Jason Miller. You can find Jason's story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, it takes a lot for public servants to speak out. More than 1,200 former Justice Department officials recently decided they needed to. This is The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Print servers in federal environments create risk and unnecessary complexity. Every new printer, location, or policy adds strain to infrastructure that was never built for today's demands. FedRAMP High Authorized Printer Logic eliminates print servers with a secure cloud-native, zero-trust solution designed for federal IT. With advanced security, centralized control, and simplified management, agencies can modernize print without added burden. See what secure serverless printing looks like. Visit Vasion.com to learn more.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. A coalition of 1,200 former Justice Department officials took the unusual step of publicly opposing the nomination of Todd Blanche as Attorney General. Beyond the confirmation debate itself, the episode raises questions about trust, morale, and the environment facing career employees. Here with more on what this reveals about today's Justice Department workforce is the Executive Director and founder of the Justice Connection, Stacey Young. Stacey, thanks so much for joining me today. It's great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
The Department of Justice has certainly had a high profile during the Trump administration, but really much of its daily work is usually non-controversial. And we're talking here about FBI and DEA and alcohol, tobacco, and firearms agents and district attorney general offices across the country. When you think of and when you're engaging with the DOJ workforce these days, what are you hearing most often from the current and former workers there?
What I'm hearing is that employees these days are really living in a culture of fear that this administration created. I want to be clear about something, though. There is still incredibly important work being done every day by career employees. There are still over 100,000 career employees at the department who are prosecuting violent crime and countering terrorism and espionage. And they're, working to keep us prosperous by enforcing antitrust laws and holding financial fraudsters accountable. They're still doing work to protect our fundamental freedoms and they're trying to keep our elected officials honest. So there's still incredibly important work keeping us safe, protecting our rights, protecting our economy. But what's happening under the surface is really distressing. Hundreds of DOJ employees have been fired under the leadership of Todd Blanche. Over 16,000 employees have left the department since the beginning of this administration. And that is because of the disrespect this administration is showing career employees at the department. And that really needs to stop before we reach a point of no return, where the work really won't be done by the department to protect this country. So we're on a very dangerous path right now, and we are doing everything we can to encourage a course correction, and we don't think that can happen under the leadership of Todd Blanche.
Your organization, the Justice Connection, mobilized more than 1,200 former DOJ officials who signed a letter opposing Mr. Blanche's nomination. But that group crossed multiple administrations in very different parts of the department. What did it take to bring that coalition together, and what was the central concern?
It wasn't quite as hard as you'd think, and considering that it's hard to get more than 2 or 3 DOJ lawyers to agree on anything. We have many thousands of DOJ alumni in our network at this point. We drafted a letter. We sent it to the alumni in our network. We encouraged them to sign, and they did in droves. And this was an opportunity for them to sign something that they couldn't edit, which, is asking a lot. And tons of them signed without us really having to push them because of how outraged DOJ alumni are about this nomination. The people who understand the department the best, the people who really care about it the most, are those who used to work there. And we are almost all sure that what is happening there right now is unacceptable. It is so far outside of the norm. It is making Americans less safe, and we want to see it stop. So it wasn't that hard for us to get that many people on our side. And what I think is really telling is that there was a letter of DOJ alumni supporting Todd Blanche that was filed after we sent our letter. And that letter attracted 77 DOJ alumni. And that letter actually isn't public. It was reported on, but we don't know what the letter says. We don't know who signed it. We only know of 4 signatories, all of whom are former political appointees. Whereas on our letter, it was almost all former career employees, people who are not used to really putting themselves out there like this, especially in a culture that is pretty hostile, in part due to Todd Blanche's leadership at the Department of Justice. So it was an enormous amount of alumni. This is something that's never happened before. And I think that the public should really take note of the fact that alumni feel as strongly as they do.
Stacey Young is the executive director and founder of the Justice Connection. Stacey, what does this letter tell us that career employees are worried about that the public may not be seeing?
We're worried about the fact that so many DOJ employees have already left on their own accord. These are the kinds of jobs that are very difficult to get. These are the kinds of jobs that people usually stay in for their entire careers. And for the fact that so many people have left really shows how dire the situation there is right now. We're also really concerned about the fact that so many DOJ employees have been diverted away from their core work. Todd Blanche has overseen initiatives to pull employees away from their mission-critical tasks. A quarter of FBI employees, for example, have been reassigned to immigration enforcement. Lawyers across the department are assigned immigration-related habeas cases. We see federal agents patrolling city streets. This kind of stuff drives employees out. This is not why they join the department. And we're also seeing the department having an extraordinarily difficult time hiring people. For jobs that used to attract hundreds or thousands of applications, we're seeing the department not be able to fill these positions at all. And that, again, is because of the terrible leadership we're seeing from the top. And the buck stops with Todd Blanche. He is leading the department right now. And we think that his record speaks for itself. He is incapable and unwilling to engage in a course correction, and we are doing everything we can to prevent him being confirmed as the next Attorney General.
You mentioned those reassignments and staffing shortfalls. You also talked about a culture of fear and retribution. What impact is that having on folks who are just trying to do their job every day?
It's really hard to do your job well if you're working under leadership that despises you, that demonizes you, that creates lies about, spreads lies about you, that calls you the deep state. It's hard to do your job well when the leaders in your office have been pushed out, which is the case in many offices across the department. It's difficult to do your job well when you fear that you'll be the next one to be ordered to carry out illegal conduct or unconstitutional conduct or unethical conduct. These situations are facing employees every day across the department. They are eroding the quality of work being done. The amount of work being done has lessened because there are fewer people doing it. And really, the integrity of the department is being questioned almost on a daily basis by judges as well. So the situation there is unlike anything we've seen. We exist to support those who are still there and to push back in the media and in the public against what we're seeing.
We've seen some other agencies under this administration where active employees have signed similar letters of concern, actually put their names on them, and had retribution actions taken against them. Your letter is signed by alumni of the department. Was there concern from the current workforce about signing such a thing?
We do not encourage current employees to engage in any kind of advocacy against leadership right now, unless they're ready to leave their jobs. The retribution they will face is almost certain. Employees have faced retribution from this administration simply for working on cases under different administrations. Speaking out publicly against this administration will almost certainly get them fired. So we do not encourage, nor do we allow current employees to join our letters, to join our public advocacy, because we are concerned about their job safety and, frankly, their safety in other respects as well. We mobilize alumni who are outside of the department to speak out, but we encourage employees to not do that. And to be clear, they do have First Amendment rights. And we do encourage employees to blow the whistle when they see unlawful or fraudulent conduct or unconstitutional conduct. But in terms of simply speaking out against this administration's policies and practices, we encourage them not to do that.
So, Stacey, whether or not Mr. Blanche is ultimately confirmed, what are you hoping to see on the workforce's behalf that would tell you that things might be changing in a positive direction?
We would like to see assurances that retaliatory firings and other conduct will stop. We want to see the department say that they will not require employees to sign NDAs in line with a new regulation that it hasn't been finalized. We would encourage the department to communicate, to telegraph to employees that they are respected, they are supported, they are the backbone of the department, which they are. We would like to see the department return flexible work options and other accommodations that make people's jobs easier to do. And we would like an absolute assurance that regardless of what employees did under prior administrations, that past work will not lead to retaliatory actions under this administration. These are very simple requests that would never have been necessary under prior administrations, but we're asking for some basic changes that we should be seeing under any leadership.
Stacey Young is the executive director and founder of the Justice Connection. Stacey, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, 2 recent Supreme Court decisions may have changed the rules for some of government's most independent institutions. But first, an $11 billion price tag gets attention. Understanding what government lost in the process may take a lot longer. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Public Citizen has released a new analysis estimating that the deferred resignation program will cost taxpayers at least $11 billion. The report examines where that money went and what agencies may have lost as experienced employees left government service. That degraded mission performance is something much harder to put a price tag on. Here to walk through the analysis is Doug Pasternak, Research Director of Public Citizen's Trump Accountability Project. Doug, thank you so much for joining me today.
Good morning. Thanks.
You've got a new report out that puts the price tag of the deferred resignation program at least $11 billion. Before we dig into the details, just a quick refresher. What is or was the DRP?
The deferred resignation program was one of several programs the Trump administration set up to try to push out federal workers or fire them. The deferred resignation program specifically allowed workers to sign on at critical points starting last year. But it forced them to stay at home, not to work, even though many of them wanted to work during this time frame. And our analysis from OPM's own data shows that the program so far has cost between $11 billion and $15 billion for the U.S. government.
Walk us through what you're actually measuring here. Is this salaries and benefits, other sorts of packages that go into that 11 to 15 billion?
Yeah, I don't want to get too far down into the weeds, but what we did is we looked at salaries plus benefits. So our analysis, the $15 billion, estimate at the high end includes a 38% factor for benefits, which is the usual number that private industry uses as well. And one thing that's really important, this program is still going on. There are still agencies that are engaged in the deferred resignation program as of just a couple of months ago, where they're reoffering this to individuals to let them go. And one of the key points of our report was it's not just the money. This has impacted people in various walks of life across the country. Doesn't matter if you're in a blue state or red state, Democrat, Republican. So many people have been impacted. It's impacted people getting Social Security checks. It's impacted people going to VA clinics to get medical care. And it's been so ineffective. And we can talk about this, but I believe the proof is in the pudding, as they say. And from our analysis, there are at least 10 agencies, I believe the number may be up to 12 now, that have rehired workers that they pushed into this program. There's been analysis from the Government Accountability Office showing that this was neither strategic nor smart nor well thought out. So that's really the crux of what our analysis did. It's a lot of money, it's ineffective, and the costs keep mounting.
All right, that's a really helpful laydown of the different pieces of this. Let's dig into each of them in order. The first just being the Trump administration came in and said the government is too big. We want fewer people working for us. Corporate organizations do this all the time. They pay severance to people that they want to leave in the course of a restructuring. How was what happened here in DRP, just from a force sizing perspective, different from that corporate model?
Sure. So first, I'm not an expert on corporate models on this front, but just very basically, the program was a resignation program. So it allowed people the opportunity to resign from public service. But a lot of people, as you know, jumped into this because they were scared they were going to get fired. And a lot of these individuals had worked for the federal government for decades. They wanted to keep working. Their programs were cut very quickly, or they were taken out of their programs. And even if they were put on the deferred resignation program, they were essentially told, great, we'll pay you for 6 months or 9 months. Some of it was shorter time periods, but they're also forbidden from going back to work, from even finishing up the programs they were in, so there would be a smooth transition. So that may happen in the corporate world where people get severance packages and that sort of thing. But in the corporate world, I think if the CEO started cutting staff randomly without any forethought to this, without any strategic plan, the shareholders of that company would be outraged. And again, what the analysis shows is there have been problems in almost every one of these cuts. And for instance, just recently, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, really critical, smaller agency in the government, helps defend against cybersecurity for both the government as well as private sector. They cut about 1,000 employees last year. And just 2 months ago, they started very quickly trying to rehire more than 300 individuals because they realized they cut them from mission critical, quote, mission critical positions. So that's just one of many examples where it shows there was no strategic method to this. And even the GAO has done several analyses on several programs, and they essentially found the same thing. One of the GAO's reports, when they were looking at IRS cuts, they said, quote, it was neither targeted nor strategic in the approach they had to laying off workers. And that, to me, is really the more fundamental issue.
Doug Pasternak is the research director of Public Citizens Trump Accountability Project. Doug, as you talk about releasing a lot of people and then having to bring people back, there's a cost, a money cost associated with the hiring process there that may not be included in your total cost of this program. But you also mentioned the cost in terms of the impact on everyday citizens. Where does that show up here?
So from what I looked at, the analysis I conducted, and there have been lots of news stories on this, I really did a literature search and looked at all the articles that were talking about this program. And what I found was that things like Social Security checks going out, it was having an impact because people were let go. People going to VA clinics that need critical medical services, they weren't getting them in time because you've got a reduction in staff. Again, the IRS in some cases, part of the deferred resignation program, about 17% of their IT staff. Critical issues that really need to be taken care of. Forest fires and firemen to help prevent that have been let go. And again, critically, this has had an impact on national security issues. There are several agencies, again, where people took part in this program and then were called back. The Department of Energy's National Nuclear Security Administration program had people called back. The Defense Information Systems Agency had people called back. As I mentioned, CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, fired people or put them on the deferred resignation program and then realized, we really need them, and called them back in to the office. So that's the impact kind of across the board. And one other point that I think is really important, you brought this up at the beginning, then the private sector, there are people that are often put on severance packages or let go. And I've seen arguments from the administration that in the long term, this will save money. What we found in one case, looking at IRS workers, was there was a report from the Yale University's budget lab, and they looked at a 22% reduction of the IRS workers and the impact that would have. And they found over a 10-year period, it would reduce revenue to the US government by $200 billion. That was a hypothetical. In reality, the Trump administration has let go 28% of IRS workers, even more than that report looked at. So it is having, and it will have over the long term, an economic impact. It's not just the $11 billion of paying these workers to stay home or take vacation or not work. There are ripple effects of this that we'll feel for a long time.
Doug, from a taxpayer perspective, how should citizens expect to see the valuation of that impact in services? Where will it show up? When will it show up? How will they be able to process whether or not ultimately this was a savings effort?
I think that's going to be really hard to do. Number one, this was the largest program the Trump administration had in terms of trying to let people go. There were about 140,000 people that took part in the deferred resignation program, but there are other programs out there too. And looking at all of that in total, again, I think it's hard to quantify the specific impact, but you do see it in, again, things that everyday Americans rely on all the time. Social Security checks being delayed and going out, people going to VA clinics, public critical parts of public health where you don't have the staff to look at that. One analogy which I've looked at is if you had a small hospital in a rural setting and you really need to cut costs, you would not go in there and randomly take a chainsaw and cut 25% of the neonatal unit staff and 50% of the cardiology staff and 35% of the neurology staff, and then do an analysis as to what staff you really needed. That is exactly what the Trump administration has done. And again, GAO, nonpartisan, non-political entity, works for Congress. In their analysis, they found that there was no strategic method. At the General Services Administration, they found they cut a ton of staff. I think it was 40%. And afterwards, then they did a workforce analysis to see the number of staff they actually needed. So they're forced to rehire staff back. So part of this issue to me is the financial cost, but the other part is the ineffective and really incompetent management in the way this program was rolled out.
Whoever comes in the next administration will be dealing with the ramifications of these actions and the implications that they have for agency mission performance. If cost is going to be difficult to quantify, is there some other metric that you'd recommend we start watching now to determine if 4 or 5 years from now we can assess the value of this approach?
Well, I think, again, GAO has done several reports. They've done at least 3 or 4, maybe it's more now, several reports on pieces of this. They've looked at specific agencies and what the impact has been. So I think you can see the impact through that. And again, what they found was there's no strategic plan here. You're letting people go. You realize you need them. You're calling them back. And as a result, you're having IT systems at the IRS, that need more staff. That's pretty freaking important, So you see the impact in those kind of ways. There are lots of forest fires now, and you have fewer firemen, out there, fighting these. That's going to have an impact. You're going to lose, homes. You're going to lose businesses as a result of not having the people out there. So I think there will be lots of analyses that will be done looking at that, and some of that has started, but I think it's going to also take a long time to get your full arms around the total cost of this.
Doug Pasternak is the Research Director of Public Citizen, Trump Accountability Project. Doug, thanks so mumuch for joining me and sharing your insights with us today.
Thank you. I appreciate the time.
We'll post this interview and a link to this report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, 2 recent Supreme Court decisions may have changed the rules for some of government's most independent institutions. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. For decades, Congress has created boards, commissions, and oversight bodies intended to operate with some distance from presidential control. 2 recent Supreme Court decisions are providing new insight into how the court views that balance and what it could mean for the people serving in those roles. Here to help us consider the implications is former FDIC Inspector General Jay Lerner. Jay, welcome back to the show. It's lovely to see you. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Terry.
Let's talk about 2 decisions that came down at the end of the Supreme Court's last term, Slaughter and Cook. One deals with officials at the Federal Reserve Board, one deals with the Federal Trade Commission, but the implications seem really much broader than the individuals whose names are on the cases. So before we get into the legal details, why are federal lawyers and agency leaders paying such close attention to these rulings?
Well, thank you, Terry. I think these are really important decisions to look at side by side, and they were issued on the same day, and both the majority opinions were written by the Chief Justice Roberts. The key question here is whether Congress can place limits on the president's authority to remove officials at independent agencies. And it really goes directly to the independence of the officials and the independence of those agencies. Because, frankly, if the official knows that they might be fired if they disagree or are not in alignment with the administration, then that might influence their decisions and motivations. And it has much broader implications than just for the FTC or the Federal Reserve. It affects many other independent agencies. I'd say that it's really a great clash of judicial philosophies between the executive powers and the legislative branch and legislative powers, and ultimately decided by the judiciary, as well as sort of distinction between law and a strict interpretation of the language versus policy decisions, and the history of the framers from the 1700s or even over the last 100 years versus the current conditions or circumstances that the government is in. So it really is a culmination of many of these forces.
Why do you think the courts treated these 2 individuals differently?
Well, let's take a look at the holdings in the case, and I think that may shed some light on it. In Slaughter, was the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, as you mentioned, and it was a 6-3 decision based on ideological lines. The FTC, as you know, protects consumers against corporate interests and unfair trade practices. And Chief Justice Roberts wrote that it was really a legal interpretation of Article 2 of the Constitution, which states that the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. And so it gave broad powers to the president to remove officials at will, which is the legal term for really no due process, no notice or opportunity to be heard. This case, the Slaughter case, overruled a 90-year precedent of Humphrey's executor, where President Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, tried to remove an FTC commissioner that had been appointed by the prior administration, President Hoover. And although Mr. Humphrey passed away before the litigation was completed, the estate, the executor, filed suit for back pay. And the court in that case in 1935 ruled that because the FTC was quasi-legislative and quasi-judicial, it wasn't necessarily acting as an executive branch agency or executive branch functions, and therefore the FTC Act was constitutional and the dismissal was unjustified. In Slaughter, it overruled that and upheld what's known as the unitary executive theory, where the president has exclusive authority over the entire executive branch. And Justice Roberts wrote that Congress nor the courts may saddle him with those with whom he cannot work. Subordinates who exercise the president's power are subject to removal by him. Then and only then can they remain accountable to the president and the president to the people. And so Chief Justice Roberts really looked at the role of the FTC and its executive branch functions like rulemaking, investigations of corporations, enforcement and lawsuits against the corporations, and then ultimately concluded when an agency executes a congressional mandate against private parties, it exercises executive power. And he says no ifs, ands, or quasis about it, referencing back to the Humphreys executor, quasi-judicial, quasi-legislative. In Cook, there was really a different sort of logic involved here. The Federal Reserve Board oversees monetary and macroeconomic policy for the government and for the country. And the holding here, also written by Chief Justice Roberts, really takes more of a policy perspective and abandons that Slaughter analysis on the executive branch functions and says because of the unique history and structure of the Federal Reserve Board and its banks, including the first, referencing back to the first and second banks of the United States, that it's one of our nation's and the world's most important financial institutions and therefore has a special arrangement sanctioned by history. And so because of that special arrangement in the history, due process is required for removal of the governors of Ms. Cook in this case. That includes notice and an opportunity to be heard so she can defend herself. Even though I should say that the Federal Reserve Board has similar sorts of functions as the Federal Trade Commission in terms of those rulemaking and then enforcement and investigations that I mentioned earlier in the Slaughter case. And so it's really sort of different logic, different analysis, and it's in one case more of a legal interpretation and the other case more of a policy indication.
Jay Lerner is the former Inspector General for the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and an adjunct professor at George Washington University. So, Jay, as I listen to you walk through those two cases, if I'm the head of an independent agency now, or maybe on the board of one, or someone serving in an oversight role, what lesson am I supposed to take from these two decisions? How do I know which way the wind is going to blow?
It's a great question, Terry, and it's not clear. The court definitely left many unanswered questions and some ambiguities in its decisions. For instance, it really didn't provide much guidance for lower courts to decide or for future litigants or those officials. One of the things that Justice Sotomayor mentions in her dissent was whether it applies to lower level officials at agencies. And she particularly mentions non-Article 3 courts or adjudicatory bodies that might not be in the judiciary, but that are part of the executive branch. And there's actually a pending case, Jackler versus the Department of Justice, where two immigration judges have brought suit against the government for their dismissal. And those are immigration judges that sit within the Department of Justice. That case is pending before the Federal Circuit, the Court of Appeals, currently.
A lot of Federal Drive listeners are going to wonder about inspectors general and other oversight officials. These cases weren't directly about IGs, but do you think they offer clues about how courts might view challenges involving inspector general removals or other independent oversight functions?
It's interesting you mentioned that because you might recall that in early 2025, 17 IGs were fired on January 24th of 2025. 8 of those IGs filed a lawsuit the next month. And in September, the judge ruled in that case that there was a violation of law. She said that was obvious because there wasn't a 30-day notice and there wasn't reasons for the removal. But she couldn't grant the preliminary injunction at that time pending the outcome of the Slaughter case. Now that the Slaughter case has been decided, that case has been revived, and there's actually a schedule between the parties that has been laid out for the judge to determine, asking for summary judgment, declaratory judgment, and back pay for those inspectors general. And so that those filings will take place in October, November, or go through October, November, and then the judge will make a decision after that. So it will have a direct effect on that lawsuit and the IG Act, the provisions of that act, and for the inspectors general.
Do you see these cases as settling the question of agency independence, or are they more likely to trigger another round of litigation?
I think there'll be more litigation. I don't know that it's been settled. I think that, there was definitely some unanswered questions, as I mentioned, in terms of the history of the agency and the relevance of that. Obviously, the court looked at that in the Cook case. Barrett, in her dissent, focused on the history of the agency. Justice Kavanaugh, in his concurrence, focused on the importance of the agency in terms of macroeconomic and monetary policy. And I think it's important to realize that these will affect many different agencies that will have different histories and different relevance. Justice Sotomayor, in the Slaughter case, mentioned a few agencies, how it will transform government and create chaos. She mentioned the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, Chemical Safety Board, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Merit Systems Protection Board. But frankly, there's lots of other agencies as well, including the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, Mine Safety, National Transportation Safety Board, and many others. And so these are really important issues, and it's unclear if the importance of the agency or the importance of those issues will influence the court's decision going forward, and therefore leading to much more litigation.
Might this be a prompt for Congress to go back and revisit this legislation? Is there a way to legislate around the court's decision here?
Question, and I think that's a little bit of an unanswered issue as well. I think that Congress can do several things in terms of the structure and organizing the executive branch, even separate from removals. So they can put qualifications on the officials that come before them. Obviously, the Senate has confirmation authority over any nominees. Congress can also legislate in terms of the role of the official, whether they are investigatory or provide information to Congress or enforce or audit or evaluate issues, what those officials are actually doing. Congress can also put performance standards on the individuals, and I think that's a really important element here. And obviously, Congress controls the purse string, and appropriate resources for certain agencies and place conditions on those appropriations and funding for the agencies. So I think there are things that Congress can do, and we'll have to see how they respond to these decisions.
Jay Lerner is the former Inspector General for the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and an adjunct professor at George Washington University. Jay, I really appreciate you walking us through these details. Thanks so much for the insight.
Thank you very much, Terry. I appreciate you having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The House narrowly passed its version of the fiscal 2027 defense policy bill last week, despite strong Democratic opposition over the bill's price tag, the war with Iran, and a provision that would expand military partnership between the United States and Israel. While much of the attention surrounding the National Defense Authorization Act focuses on the bill's massive price tag, foreign policy, and partisan writers, the must-pass package includes several provisions affecting the Defense Department's civilian workforce. Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis joins me to break down what measures impacting civilians made it into the bill and what was left out. Anastasia, thanks for being here.
Hi, Terry.
The House NDAA includes a provision for military pay raises. Does it say anything about pay raises for defense civilians?
The House version of the bill includes a 5 to 7% pay raise for service members depending on their rank. And that's in line with the president's budget request. However, just to remind everyone, the Senate's version or the Senate Armed Services Committee's version of NDAA proposed a 3.6% across the board pay raise increase. So that's going to be a point of contention moving forward. But for the civilian workforce, the House and the Senate are very silent on a pay raise for civilians. It's not surprising. There is no mention of a pay increase for civilians in the Trump administration's budget request. Civilian pay is addressed outside of the defense authorization process, but some Democrats said it's a really missed opportunity for lawmakers to provide a pay increase for the civilian workforce. For instance, one representative from Maryland voted against the NDAA, saying that this disparity is wrong and that the bill has a massive price tag, and yet there is no money to ensure parity in raises. And he also encouraged the Senate to address this issue, but so far, and again, we only have the Senate Armed Services Committee's version, they've been silent on civilian pay.
Anastasia, were there other provisions that did make it into the bill that would have an impact on the defense civilian population?
I actually wanted to highlight provisions that didn't make it into the bill. So, for example, Republican Representative Glenn Grothman, he offered an amendment that would require DoD to examine options for reducing its civilian workforce by about 200,000 employees. That amendment was rejected. 43 Republicans joined Democrats to oppose it. And let's hear from Glenn Grothman and his explanation of the amendment.
We know that DOJ felt that throughout government they had unnecessary personnel. And we have all heard anecdotal evidence of people working in a variety of agencies, but particularly the Department of War, who may not be necessary. I'll point out, since I have kind of looked into this, that I have found shocking anecdotes of people working in the private sector, in big companies, who manage to get by doing very little work because the companies are just plain too big and people fall between the cracks. If that's going in private sector big companies, think how much more likely that's happening in a big organization like the Department of War. In any event, right now we're dealing with a situation in which the Department of War is asking for a considerable increase in money, in particular with regard to its authorization bill and also with regard to the other bill that we're going to be trying to be passing this week. So given that, we have to make sure that they're not wasting any money. And I think it'd be a good exercise for the Department of War to say, we've got of these 705,000 people, what would happen if we had to get rid of 200,000? Maybe we'll find they're all necessary, but I don't think so.
And so in 2025, the Defense Department reduced the size of its civilian workforce. I think the number is around 10%. But Terry, you and I have talked about it. And the Government Accountability Office found that the Pentagon didn't really analyze the impacts of these reductions. And they have no plan to assess lessons learned from its 2025 workforce reduction efforts. So that was kind of the opposition to this amendment. Then other amendment that I wanted to highlight that was also defeated was a measure that wanted to strike another provision that bars DoD from using fiscal 2027 funds to implement Trump's executive order that removed collective bargaining rights for civilian workers who work in agencies with national security missions. So that provision is still in the House version of NDAA. We'll see if the Senate Armed Services Committee's version also has this similar language, the same provision, but we'll see if it survives because last year it failed and it never made it into the final version of the bill. So we'll see how that pans out.
Anastasia, as you recite those concerns there, it makes me also wonder whether the bill addresses anything about the ongoing hiring freeze in the Defense Department.
Yeah, so the legislation wants to bar the Defense Department from using its 2027 funds to implement a hiring freeze for a number of different civilian roles. That would include military medical personnel, that would include childcare workers, employees at depots and shipyards. But technically, many of these positions are already exempt under current DoD policy. And also, I wanted to highlight that, interestingly enough, lawmakers want to prohibit DoD from using fiscal 2027 funds to terminate employees in military child development programs, as well as DHA or Defense Health Agency workers and the Department of Defense Education activity workers. I think it's interesting because, we know that a lot of DHA workers left through DRP. They weren't terminated, but they left.
It sounds like there's a lot of effort to protect certain populations within the defense civilian workforce. Are there any efforts on the positive side to reinforce some, like the acquisition workforce? It usually gets quite a bit of attention.
Yeah, definitely. So last year's NDAA was focused on acquisition reform, but they didn't really address the acquisition workforce. This year, the House is addressing the acquisition workforce because the Defense Department's acquisition budgets have grown significantly in recent years. But at the same time, the acquisition workforce has had a lot of challenges, even before the 2025 workforce reductions. So, for example, lawmakers want DoD to have the centralized dashboard. That dashboard would track the acquisition workforce size, its composition, skills, certifications of the workers, vacancy rates, career progression. It would track data on retention, career progression, etc. So that could be helpful. Then they also want DoD to have a new chief acquisition talent officer. That person would be in charge of the department-wide acquisition workforce strategy. And then also one provision that I will highlight is lawmakers want DoD to change how the department evaluates its civilian acquisition workforce. So rather than focusing mainly on acquisition professionals' training and certifications, Congress wants DoD to evaluate them based on how well they apply various innovative acquisition approaches and practices. We'll see how it works out. DoD already has analytics tools to visualize workforce data. DoD already has senior officials to advocate for the workforce. It's interesting that they want to evaluate them based on how well they apply these new acquisition approaches and practices, because are workers equipped tools, to take on a risk? We'll see how it plays out.
That's Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. Anastasia, thanks for keeping us up to date. There's a lot to watch here.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find her full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.